I still remember the sound of their laughter like it was a physical thing that hit my chest. Before I continue, tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever faced betrayal, hit like and subscribe, because what happened next will shock you. They pointed at my shoes first. Not because they were old, they were scuffed, sure, but because they weren't the shiny kind my cousins expected to parade around their manicured living room. My dress was thrift store chic, someone might say now. But in that moment, it felt like someone had stripped me naked. I walked in carrying a small duffel, and my head held high the way my mama taught me, and the room dropped into a silence that tasted like judgment. "I'm surprised you showed up," my cousin Tamika said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Thought we'd at least get a laugh out of it," laughed Marcus, the cousin who'd always treated success like a religion. They all circled me with their smiles sharpened like knives. I smiled too. It was a thin thing, a practice thing I've used my whole life when storm clouds gather. But inside my hands trembled. Inside I was cataloging every face, every look, every exile disguised as amusement. I've been on the receiving end of family shame before. I know that look. It means you don't belong here, and we will tell you so. "Where you been living?" Aunt Lillian asked, the way it sounds when someone doesn't think what you have is valid. "In town," I said. "Working." Oh, the word working, it set them off, like I had confessed to a sin instead of saying I had a job. "Doing what?" someone asked, not bothering to hide the condescension. "Different things," I said. "I do hair, I do temp work, I'm saving up." They exchanged looks like I had admitted to a misdemeanor. "Girl, you look like you need a new life," Tamika said. "Or at least a better closet." I felt all my quiet victories shrink under the ceiling of that room. But I did not leave. I had come for something else. You need to understand, this wasn't just about clothes. This was the latest chapter in a family history thick with whispers. We were the kind of family who kept score, who measured worth in houses and college degrees, and the ability to buy the nicest things on a whim, who treated kindness as a currency, and only the wealthy were permitted lavishly to be kind. When my grandmother died, the house she left behind was a character in our lives for years, the one place where history leaned into us like an old aunt and told secrets. Grandma Hattie had been the anchor. She wore church hats and could cut up a roast like a surgeon. She raised people who didn't always raise themselves, me included. When she got sick, it was me who sat with her through the nights, me who fixed her tea when her hands shook, me who listened to her stories about the old neighborhood and the people who had meant something once and then drifted away. I did that because she had been kind to me when no one else was. I didn't do it for money. I did it because she was my grandmother, and she was all the family that mattered to me. So when word spread that the will was going to be read, when a cousin called and said there would be a small gathering, I went. I went because I wanted to attend, because I believed in closure, because it felt like the right thing to do. I also went because I'd seen the eyes. Even if I had nothing, I wanted to show them I had integrity. And maybe, selfishly, I wanted them to see what they'd been missing. The lawyer arrived 2 hours late. He was a thin man in a dark suit, a little too proper for the living room that smelled of pot roast and polish. He placed the envelope on the low table like it was an artifact. He cleared his throat and began to speak in that slow, measured tone lawyers use when they want everyone to know that they mean business. "In the matter of the estate of Hattie Mae Johnson," he said, "we will proceed with the reading." There is always a moment right before the reveal where a room holds its breath. You know that feeling, a pause like a held note in a song. I watched the faces. The cousins leaned forward. My aunt folded her hands like a fan. Marcus was already smiling because he knew how to pretend victory, like it had religious merit. I felt calm, oddly calm. Maybe it was because I had nothing to lose. Maybe it was because I'd already been humiliated before. But then the lawyer read the line that hit like an unseen blow. "To my granddaughter, Mariah Johnson," he said, "I leave the sum of $50,000. It was a polite, perfunctory sum, not a whole life. Marcus snorted. "50,000? That's it? For her?" Tamika said. I felt the room tilt. "To my daughter Lillian," the lawyer read, "I leave the family home at 324 South Elm Street." Now there was the sound of small celebrations. There were murmurs. Aunt Lillian's lips thinned into a smile that had teeth. She offered me a glance, one that said, "See, the estate's back where it belongs." I clapped politely along with the others when the lawyer kept reading. There were bequests of jewelry and small cash amounts, the sort of ritual that passes the familiar artifacts of the dead among the living. At the end, when the last paper had been set down, the lawyer added a paragraph that no one expected. "There is one additional provision," he said. "A trust has been established. The detailed terms will be shared at the bank when the beneficiaries are ready to execute them." My stomach fluttered. The lawyer left the room with his briefcase and the whisper of air conditioning his only companion. After he left, the conversation turned to the usual things. Small talk that attempted and failed to disguise the greed. "That trust better be substantial," Marcus muttered. "We know Hattie had some savings." Aunt Lillian's eyes flicked to me. "You'll let me see how this goes, right?" she said. "You know how to help with—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. She wanted control. She wanted to be the one who got to decide. I left their smiles and their sideways barbs. Outside, the air felt like an ally. I called the bank the next morning. "Yes, the trust exists," the clerk said, in the tone of a person who has to repeat facts to people who are always surprised by them. "You have to come in to see the details," she added. The bank was one of those chilly marble places where the lights make your face look like it's in a photograph you can't change. I sat in the lobby and watched the clock like it would give me permission when its hands finished circling. When the trust documents were revealed, the first thing I noticed was that Grandma had been thorough. She had written a letter, hand tremulous but clear. "To my Mariah," it read, "you have always been my steady." There were terms, a will within a will, clauses designed to protect the money until the beneficiary proved certain obligations. It wasn't a simple, "you get this now" kind of gift. It was Hattie making sure her love didn't get squandered. The trust named me the executor of a small business fund she wanted to start in the old neighborhood. It also named me the primary beneficiary in the event the fund could not be established for reasons beyond my control. There were assets, accounts in Grandma's name, a life insurance policy, a few acres of land that had been quietly appreciating. The numbers were not the kind you use to buy a continent, but they were meaningful. They were a ladder. And hidden in the fine print was something else, a clause that required the executor to be present for annual audits, a clause that required the executor to show evidence of stewardship. It was like Grandma had put a compass in my hands and told me to walk true. When I left the bank, I felt a kind of fear and gratitude that made me dizzy. This was private. This was mine. Except family is never content to let things be private. Word moves through families like gossip through grapevines, fast and sour. By the time I turned back into town, my cousins already knew something had happened. "She got something," someone said as I passed. "Probably not much," Marcus added, like he could make my life small by saying it. I kept my face neutral because I had learned that showing any thin thread of vulnerability only gave them a handle. But I began to notice the shifts. Calls that used to be casual became calls that needed favors. Tamika wanted help with a babysitter. Aunt Lillian invited me over often, the kind of invitations that taste like scheming. "Keep your receipts," I told the bank manager when I went again. "Do whatever the trust needs," I told myself in the mirror. I told no one about the full extent of the assets because I knew the pattern. Family sees change and immediately begins to strategize. They begin to measure you for new shoes. So I played quiet. For months I worked. I made myself useful. I did hair for ladies trying to look a certain way for church. I temped at the courthouse sorting files. I took on a small job helping a woman run a boutique, learning inventory, learning small business life, learning bookkeeping the hard way. Every dollar I saved, I put into a jar. Every time someone suggested I blow it on something nice, I shook my head and said no. Why save it? Tamika would ask, as if thrift was a misdemeanor. Because I want something that lasts, I told her. Once, at a family function, someone placed a casserole dish on the table and said loud enough for everyone, "Imagine Mariah with a house like that. She'd know how to cook a roast." The room buzzed with cheap amusement. I froze. I remember thinking at that moment, not out loud, just inside. Have you ever felt betrayal like that? It wasn't anything they had said yet. It was the knowledge that your presence could be used as punchline. So I kept my head down, but slowly, quietly, I used the trust the way Grandma wanted me to. I pulled small loans. I asked for help from a mentor at the bank who believed in community funds. I opened a boutique collective in an old storefront that smelled like dust and possibility. It was the kind of place where people could sell crafts and hair care and get microloans. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't overnight. It was rows of sweat and patience and learning to write grant applications. The boutique became a small success. Not the kind of news that makes headlines, but it made rent. It gave people opportunities. It gave a woman named Renee a place to sell her candles, and a young man named Darnell a place to learn how to manage inventory. I posted photos not on purpose, more like small, casual glimpses. But in a world where everyone is thirsting for proof, those photos do the heavy lifting of rumor. One day, my cousins dropped by chance. They walked in like they belonged, eyes scanning, mouths tight, trying to piece together how this woman they'd mocked had managed to improvise something respectable. "You doing all right?" Marcus asked, tone neutral, like he was testing me. "I'm fine," I said. "We're doing community classes on budgeting next week." Aunt Lillian smiled like she'd swallowed bait. "That's nice," she said. "Who funded it?" I hesitated. I wanted to say, "Grandma." Instead, I said, "A small trust, a loan, me." They pretended not to hear the last word, but they heard it. Soon enough, rumors escalated. They called me modestly up behind my back. They whispered about my sudden uptick, as if money could be infected like a disease. It turned out they liked the idea of poverty because it made them feel better about the things they had. They liked victims. They liked easy hierarchies. And when the boutique grew, when sales increased, and the people I helped started to pay back microloans, the whispering became more aggressive. "How much did you inherit?" Aunt Lillian asked one afternoon, the way someone asks for an amount at a pawn shop. "Enough to start something," I said. They didn't like that answer. They had been preparing always to take. There is a peculiar cruelty in families when money enters the picture. It makes them behave like strangers. So when the day came that the lawyer called with more news, I was not entirely surprised. He asked if I could attend an official reading at the county courthouse. "There's a matter regarding additional estate disbursements," he said, formal and deliberate. I knew then this would not be just a small ripple. The courthouse is a building designed to swell people's anxieties. Marble, pillars, the hush of people who have learned to hold their breath where decisions are made. I arrived early. The hearing room smelled like coffee and old legal pads. There were more people than I expected. My cousins sat in the gallery like a troop of vultures waiting for a parade to start. The lawyer stood at the front with a thick binder that made his hands look solemn. "Good morning," he said. "Thank you for coming." He began to read. "Because of the appreciation of certain assets, and because of provisions set forth by Hattie Mae Johnson," he said, "the court has authorized additional disbursements." My heart thudded. In addition to the funds previously discussed, the estate now includes an irrevocable trust in the amount of $1 million. The lawyer read. The room swallowed its noise. $1 million. Marcus's jaw dropped like a trapdoor. Tamika's lipstick left its glass. Aunt Lillian held her hand to her chest like a woman who had just been touched by revelation. But then the lawyer said the words that changed the shape of the room. "The court recognizes the executor's proven stewardship," he said, "and as set forth in the trust, an additional disbursement will be made to the primary beneficiary, Mariah Johnson, in the control and management of the community fund and microloan program established in her name." There were gasps. There were looks. The gallery erupted like waves. I felt my face go pale and hot all at once. This is where the twist sat, not as a thunderclap, but as the slow burn of revelation. They had expected riches to be parceled to the loudest and the most insistent. They had expected the familiar pattern. The house goes to the eldest, the jewels to the one who fusses the loudest. Instead, Grandma had left a resource to the person who showed up and stayed, who cared for people rather than polished the pews in front of the best view. "How does this work?" Marcus demanded, voice high and brittle. "How much is she getting?" Tamika asked, hand wide like offering. The lawyer looked at me with professional calm. "Ms. Johnson," he said, "the trust is in your name for the community fund. The trust grants you discretion to allocate funds to microloans, to small business grants, and to property acquisition for affordable housing in the neighborhoods specified in the trust. The estate will provide the corpus and annual distributions as required. The assets are substantial enough to fund the initiatives described without further court action." I let the words wash over me. $1 million. A lifetime's worth of small, steady comforts. But more than that, the power to change a block, to build a place where people like the ones who sell in my boutique could thrive. Meanwhile, in the gallery, my family recalculated their relationships. They had based their affection on inheritance, on proximity to a ledger. Now the ledger favored someone they'd publicly scorned. I saw envy twist their faces into something old and ugly. I felt vindication, sure, but I also felt sorrow. Because the thing that made me worthy in Grandma's eyes, the thing that mattered most, was the very thing they tried to shame me for: my capacity to care. They had mocked my clothes, but did not mock my heart. They had measured me by shoes, but not by the people I helped. There was a justice in watching them struggle with that logic, but it was also a painful kind of justice. After the hearing, the whispers turned to strategy. "She needs accountants," Aunt Lillian said, eyes already calculating. "We should help her manage it." "Yeah, family should be involved," Marcus said, using the royal "we" like a claim. "Maybe we could be on the board," Tamika suggested. It was subtle, but the current changed. They wanted in. They wanted a seat at the table. I thought about that offer. Part of me wanted to say yes, to bring them in, to show forgiveness like Grandma would have. But I'd learned that when greedy hands touch sacred things, they often rip them apart. So I said no. "Board members will be chosen by the terms of the trust," I said, careful as a person opening a safe. "There's a process." The process, as it turned out, required me to show proof of stewardship: meetings, budgets, reports. It required transparency, which was oddly what the family hated. They liked the idea of being beneficiaries, but hated the idea of being accountable. So I gathered the people I trusted. Renee, who made the best candles and taught youth entrepreneurship. Darnell, who had grit and bookkeeping patience. Mrs. Caldwell from church, who knew how to manage a fund without fanfare. I hired a small nonprofit attorney who taught me how to read bylaws without falling asleep. We created a simple structure: an advisory board, a microloan committee, a rotating grant program. It was not glamorous. It was a lot of paperwork, but every signature was a stitch in a net that would catch the next person who fell. When I announced the first round of grants, the neighborhood came out like it had been waiting for the sun. A barber named Luis got enough to buy new clippers. A woman opened a pop-up bakery. A young student paid for a community college class. It was slow, but the change was real. Word traveled. Journalists came once, wrote nice things, then moved on. But the people who mattered, the parents, the kids, the women starting small businesses, they stayed. My cousins watched it all like a telenovela, where the lead had suddenly become wealthy and moral. They tried to insert themselves. "Mariah, you should let me help with the grant writing," Tamika said at one point. "I have experience with marketing," Marcus offered. I had a choice. I could let them into the projects and watch them take the edges off everything that made it honest, or I could keep them at a distance and protect the mission. It wasn't an easy decision. When family asks for a place at your table, your heart is tempted to say yes, because blood tastes like obligation. But I had learned something in the months since Grandma's death. I had learned that love and leverage are not the same thing. So I set firm boundaries. Board seats would be based on skill and integrity, not lineage. If they wanted to participate, they would have to apply like anyone else and show a record of service. You should have seen the look on Aunt Lillian's face. She began to call more, suddenly interested in volunteering at the boutique. "Can I help with accounting?" she asked, as if suddenly fascinated by ledgers she had always ignored. I smiled and said, "The board meets the second Tuesday of each month. Meet the criteria, and you can apply." She didn't apply. They tried other strategies: guilt, games, offers of help that came with strings. I learned to keep responses short and slow. I learned to use the pause like a shield. Have you ever felt betrayal like that? I ask you again, because this is the human condition we're dealing with. Kin turned opportunists. There were nights I lay awake thinking about what it meant to be the person who had the power to change a neighborhood, and also the person who had been laughed at for a thrift store dress. I asked myself, do you become mean when you get power? Do you become the exact kind of person who once judged you? I was determined not to. But power is a mirror, and mirrors are dangerous if you don't know which face you want to keep. One afternoon, a name came across the boutique's voicemail that stopped me. It was a woman from a local news outlet asking if I would attend a community leaders forum. "You're being recognized for your work with the microloan program," she said. The recognition was nice. It was also a spotlight that made my cousins twitch. They wanted to be in the photos. They wanted to be on the stage. "Can we come?" Tamika asked. "You're part of the family, right?" Marcus added. "No," I told them. "This is for the people who've been actively involved." They were furious. You can't make someone love you by giving them money. You can't make someone care about a mission simply by pointing to a ledger. And in that fury, things got uglier. One night, after a board meeting, I found a stack of anonymous letters in my mailbox. They were cruel. They whispered lies about mismanaged funds, about favoritism, about spending money on luxuries. "How dare they?" Renee said when we read them together. "It must be a mistake," Darnell said, but his jaw clenched like a man who knows too many things at once. I took the letters to our nonprofit attorney. "We'll do an audit," she said. "Transparency is our best defense." So we did. We hired independent auditors. We published reports. We invited public scrutiny. The numbers were clean. Every grant could be accounted for. Every dollar followed a trail. But public proof doesn't always stop private hunger. Aunt Lillian came by the boutique one afternoon with a casserole dish and a smile that was too wide. "You're doing good work, Mariah," she said. "The family is proud." I accepted the casserole, but later I found a note inside the box that said simply, "You won't last." A tiny, poisonous thing. I wanted to cry. Instead, I went to the mirror and told myself the truth. This was about more than me. It was about the people who would be helped when I kept going. So I kept going. I kept building, applying for grants, speaking at forums, and sitting in long meetings with city officials. The microloan program grew from a handful of loans to a steady pipeline. We bought a small property and converted it into affordable rental units. We started a mentorship program for young women. Everything we did was accountable. Everything we did had paperwork and hearts attached. And yet, the family kept up their attacks in whispers. It was as if the only way they could see themselves was reflected in the ledger. They wanted to be part of the story, but they wanted to be the star. Then came the day the estate lawyer called again. I had a habit, or a superstition, of answering his calls. He wasn't the type to call without wait. "Ms. Johnson," he said, "there is further action required to transfer title on the South Elm property to the trust." I felt my heart go light and heavy at once. "Is this about donations?" I asked. He explained that part of the estate had been in the form of real property. The South Elm lot was older, had been rented for years, and had unexpected equity. "The court has determined it best serves the purposes of the trust that the property be transferred into the trust's holdings," he said. "However," he continued, "there are several family members contesting the transfer on the grounds of prior occupancy and claimed repairs. In English, they wanted to fight for the property. We could have folded. We could have let them fight, let the money be siphoned into legal fees, let their noise drown the mission. But Grandma's voice, or rather, the memory of her steady hands, kept me anchored. We answered their claims with paper, with patience, with affidavits, with photos, with receipts of the boutique's good works in the neighborhood. We hired a small but principled legal team. We documented everything. Court is a theater of patience. There are hearings and continuances and motions that stretch like rubber bands. Family shows its true colors in court. They say things over and over until repetition is supposed to make it true. They called witnesses who leaned toward them like gravestones. They tried to argue that because Aunt Lillian had lived in the house at 324 South Elm for 12 years, she had a moral claim. They said that the community fund was a vanity. They said I was too young. They said a lot of things that families say when they don't want to accept someone else's stewardship. The judge, a woman with a voice like tempered steel, listened. She listened to the affidavits and the ledgers, to the testimonies and the charity's impact reports. She listened to the men who thought anger equaled entitlement. Then she made a slow, deliberate ruling. "Based on the clear terms of the will and trust," she said, "and based on documented stewardship demonstrated by the executor and beneficiary, the transfer shall be permitted." My hands shook. There was applause from the gallery. A small sound like a ripple. My cousins left the courtroom with their jaws clenched, their dignity switched off like a light. Justice had a weight that day, but the victory was complicated. The week after the ruling, Aunt Lillian showed up at the boutique with a petition. "We just want transparency," she said, clipboard in hand. She had gathered signatures from people who claimed to be concerned. It was performative. But it also reflected a reality. When one person gets something, others scramble to be part of it. I did the only thing I knew to do. I opened the books. We set up a monthly community meeting. Anyone could come. We presented the budgets. We explained the microloan criteria. We let the people decide a quorum. And slowly, the whispering died down, replaced by the sound of real people getting help. What they couldn't take from me was the effect on the neighborhood. The barber shop, newly equipped, thrummed with customers. The bakery's oven fired up with loaves that smelled like possibility. Young men in the mentorship program started paying back loans and then relending to others. This is what Grandma wanted: to change a place with dignity and resources, to make someone's life an instrument rather than an ornament. So the trust fulfilled its purpose. And as the program succeeded, the family's interest waned. Aunt Lillian found other things to fuss over. Tamika stopped calling when she realized this wasn't a money machine. Marcus tried to buy influence with philanthropy he could market. In the end, there was a turning point that solidified everything. It happened at a community meeting when a young mother named Alyssa stood up. Her voice trembled because she was scared of public speaking. She had used a microloan to buy equipment for a daycare she ran out of her living room. "Before this," she said, "I thought I'd lose my kids if something happened. I had no safety net." She looked at me, and in that moment, the room seemed to thin into one line between us. "Now I have employees," she said. "Now I can pay someone to watch my baby while I work." Now I can sleep." The room clapped like rain. I sat there thinking of my grandmother and how she loved church potlucks more than anything. This was the kind of abundance she would have liked. It wasn't about big houses and shiny things. It was about safety and dignity. When Aunt Lillian chimed in later with a suggestion about efficiency, there was a murmur. But people had seen the difference in their lives. They voted for the plan unanimously. It was the moment I stopped thinking about what they'd said to me when I walked in wearing old clothes. It was the moment I realized the money and the trust were not trophies. They were tools, and tools are meant to be used. After that, life settled into a new rhythm. There were more meetings, more victories, more small heartaches. There was an instance where a loan defaulted, and we forgave a debt because a man had a health crisis. There was a time the boutique lost a batch of goods to a flood, and the community came together to restock. There were press mentions and small grants that helped. One evening, months later, my cousins came over again. They brought a cake. They said they'd been thinking about reconciliation. I considered the cake like you consider a weather system, cautiously. "People change," Tamika said. "We were wrong." "Could we get a tour?" Marcus asked, eyes soft like a man trying on a new shirt. I let them in. I showed them the ledger. I let them meet the people whose lives had changed. They looked at the photos of the renovated property and the kids who had scholarships. Their faces softened, but there were still moments where old habits almost won. One afternoon, Aunt Lillian reached across the table and said, "I just want to be useful." "You are," I told her, "but useful looks different than you expected." She cried then, quietly. Maybe she finally saw that giving is not the same as taking. Maybe she finally felt the humility of someone who had to learn how to be kind without a calculator. We didn't become a perfect family overnight. We found ways to coexist. They came around sometimes to volunteer. Sometimes they were honest. Sometimes they weren't. What mattered was that what Grandma had done, quietly, with prayer and conviction, had ripple effects that couldn't be bought away. And the big twist, the thing the lawyer revealed, wasn't about wealth the way people think of wealth. It was about trust, about who you choose to empower, about the difference between entitlement and stewardship. It was about the fact that a woman in old clothes, the one they laughed at, was the one holding the key to the kind of change that really matters. There were days I still thought about the laughter. There were nights I woke remembering the weight of that first moment. But the sound of children learning in the storefront, the smell of bread rising in the little bakery, the hum of barbershops and laundromats, those sounds were better companions than any bitterness. And sometimes, when I walk past the old house on South Elm, now part of the Trust's holdings, I think of Grandma standing on her porch, watching me with her head tilted like she always did when she was proud. I whisper, "I did right, and I mean it." Justice came in court, yes, but the real justice came in the way people's lives shifted, in the way dignity replaced mockery. I am not perfect. I have made mistakes. I've been naive about who to trust and strict with who to welcome. But I have learned that when you hold power, you must be brave enough to use it for others. In the end, my cousin's laughter became a memory like any other. It has weight, but it does not bend me. One day, Aunt Lillian said something simple that changed things for me. She took my hand in hers in the kitchen and said, "You were right to take care of Hattie. You were the steady one." I looked at her and saw a woman who had been humbled. "Thank you," I said. We cried, we cooked, we argued again later. But there was a truer thread now. I tell this not to boast. I tell it because somewhere out there someone might be walking in old clothes and feeling small. Maybe they're about to inherit a fight they didn't ask for. Maybe they're about to have their life rearranged by the actions of a relative who sees worth where others saw nothing. If you're that person, keep going. Keep being steady. Do the work that matters in small, tenacious ways. Don't be seduced by the idea that money must always change people for the worse. It can, if those who get it, forget who they are. but it can also change people for the better if you let it be used like a bridge. There were nights I thought the family would never forgive me. There were afternoons I tried to imagine a future where their apologies were real and tender. But forgiveness is not always clean or complete. Sometimes it is a series of small acts that, over time, rebuild trust. I didn't wait for apologies. I kept working, I kept building, and sometimes they came around on their own. Towards the end, there was one small private moment that I hold like a jewel. It was late in the summer, after a community fundraiser. We had raised money for a scholarship. A young woman I had mentored, Clarissa, hugged me hard and said, "You saved me." She had tears. So did I. The family watched a few feet away. Tamika mouthed something and then clapped, genuinely this time. Marcus took a photo not to gloat, but to keep. Aunt Lillian stood back until the end, then came up and hugged me. No words were needed. That hug was a small, honest currency. The estate lawyer had done what the law required. He had read the will, he had managed the letters, he had allocated funds. He had been the herald of the twist. But the real twist was not the dollars. It was recognition. That the steady person in old clothes could be the one to change the map. This story is not about revenge. It is not about rubbing shoulders with the very people who once laughed. It is about what happens when you let love and stewardship define your choices. If you are sitting there watching this and thinking of your own family, the ones who laugh, the ones who doubt, remember this. Power can become mercy if you hold it that way. Money can become destiny if you refuse to be corrupted by it. A legacy can be a life if you let it touch people. I look at the work we do now, and I think of Grandma Hattie sitting on her front steps, hands folded. "She always knew," Renee says sometimes. "She knew you'd do right." Maybe she did, because sometimes the people you least expect are the ones who carry the clearest moral compass. I walked into a living room once wearing old clothes and left with a mission. They laughed. Then, quietly, the estate lawyer read who a true millionaire was. A millionaire, not of money only, but of purpose, of stewardship, of lives changed. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and watch the next story. It's even more unbelievable.